I think Go Jackson is a good example of what is missing in our world today. My guess is there is an ingredient missing in the world, and that ingredient that is missing has led to a lot of the problems in your life too. There is something that is missing that caused you to have problems in your marriage. There's something that's missing that caused you to have problems with your boss or with your children or with your parents. There's something that is missing. There's an ingredient missing in the world today when it comes to just the overall tone of the conversation in politics. There is an ingredient missing when you think about the horrible things that have happened over the last few weeks, everything from the shooting at the private school to the young Ukrainian woman who lost her life on public transportation in North Carolina, to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. There is something missing in our world. And we even see it go on from there. Even the discussions and the conversations that have happened in these last couple of weeks, you can see it online. There is something terribly missing in our world today. And it is the same thing that has been missing in your life and your personal challenges that you've had too. The thing that is missing is the thing that would make the difference in your family. It's the thing that would make the difference in our country and our society. This one ingredient, if we could just figure out how to make sure that we bring this ingredient to every conversation, that we bring this ingredient to every relationship, that we include it in every public discussion, it would literally change the world overnight. And I want to talk to you about that one missing ingredient, because we see its absence a lot in Scripture, and then we see the shocking, revolutionary inclusion of this ingredient in the ministry and the life of Jesus. But for the last several weeks, we've been looking at the life of an Old Testament character by the name of Jacob. If you have a Bible, open with me to Genesis chapter 48. We've been journeying through Jacob's life, and we're getting to the end of his story. And today, we're going to see the missing ingredient in Jacob's life. But my hope is that we're going to realize it's the missing ingredient in our life too. And it's a missing ingredient in the world around us. And that we, as people who are followers of Jesus, will see it as our responsibility to bring that ingredient into our relationships and into our conversations and into the world today. So if you have a Bible, look with me at Genesis chapter 48. I'll begin in verse 8. Genesis 48, beginning in verse 8. When Israel, that's Jacob, by the way. Some of you were with us a couple weeks ago. His name was Jacob. God changed his name to Israel after a wrestling match. And he said, your name's no longer going to be Jacob, but it's going to be Israel, because you have wrestled or contended with God and with man, and you have overcome. So here he is. When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, who are these? Now, we didn't really get into it in our time in the sermons, but if you've been a part of a small group, you know that Jacob had 12 sons. His favorite son was Joseph. And Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, because you wanted to sell some of your siblings into slavery at some point too. So they sold Joseph into slavery, but they told Jacob that Joseph was dead. And so Jacob lived a good part of his life thinking this favorite son was dead. But then he found out not only was he still alive, but he was the prime minister of Egypt, and he was the one who was basically going to save the entire family and the entire nation by providing food at a time of famine. So Jacob had been brought down to Egypt, where he comes face to face with not only Joseph, but his two sons. And so he says, whose sons are these? And Joseph responds, they are the sons God has given me here, Joseph said to his father. Then Israel said, bring them to me so that I may bless them. So that I may bless them. Now, Israel, Jacob's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. Now, that sounds familiar. For those of you who've been journeying with us for a few weeks, it should sound familiar. We're going to come back to that in a second. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again. And now God has allowed me to see your children too. Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knee and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh on his left towards Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his hand and put his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head. Then, though he was the younger, and crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all the days of my life, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my father, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand and he moved it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, "No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." He blessed them that day and said, "In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Now, as we've been going through this story, if you've been tracking with us, you will quickly discover that this is the most boring story of all the stories we've told about Jacob, right? I mean, some of you are sitting there thinking, what is this about? Like this seems almost irrelevant. Think about the other stories we've told. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw Jacob wrestling with God like it was a fight to the death. We saw all the intrigue and all the struggles that he had with his father-in-law as his father-in-law tricked him into marrying his older daughter Leah, and then he had to work 7 more years. We saw his brother Esau attempt to kill him, and he's running for his life. We saw him dressed up like his brother trying to trick his dad. We've seen so many great scenes from Jacob's life, and we end with this one. And it seems completely irrelevant and boring until you read something from the New Testament. See, in the New Testament, there is a book called Hebrews, and in the book of Hebrews, there is a section called the Roll Call of Faith. And in this Roll Call of Faith, the writer of Hebrews is basically giving a who's who of the Old Testament. And so he talks about Abraham and Moses, and he talks about all these people. And every time he mentions them, he talks about one particular story that exemplifies why they are a hero of the faith. And of all the things he could have said about Jacob, he points to this encounter. He says about Jacob, he says, "And by faith, Jacob blessed the younger brother instead of the older brother." So this, for whatever reason, the writer of Hebrews says, this is the story, this is the significant story that shows that Jacob was a great person of faith. Why? Why is that? I think the reason is because this story draws together what is the most significant expression of Jacob's faith. It draws together everything that has been going on throughout his entire life, and it shows the overpowering theme of Jacob's life, and it's the same thing that was missing. It was the same thing that was missing when he was fighting with his father, when he was fighting with his brother, when he was fighting with his father-in-law. And it's the same thing missing in your life when you have relationship problems. It's the same thing missing on social media. It's the same thing missing in politics. And the overarching theme of Jacob's life is the need for grace. It is the need for grace in our lives. And so we see it here, that almost at the very end, after he's fought with his dad and his brother and his father-in-law, at the very end, right before he dies, as he's giving this blessing, we see that Jacob finally gets the missing ingredient. And the missing ingredient all along was grace. So I want to talk about 3 aspects of grace. We're going to go through the first 2 very quickly, and we're going to spend a little more time on the third. But we see all 3 aspects of grace in this story. The first one is the need for grace. Look with me at verse 15. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my father Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day." Now, this is an interesting thing that Jacob is saying, and it's interesting for a couple reasons. First of all, because Jacob is calling God his good shepherd, his shepherd. This is the first time in Scripture that anybody ever referred to God as a shepherd. Now, if you've been in church any amount of time, if you've gone to Sunday school, or even if you've just been to a funeral, we're all familiar with this idea of God being our shepherd. In fact, the most famous psalm in the entire Bible, probably one of the most famous pieces of poetry in all the earth, is "The Lord is my shepherd, right? David wrote this in the Psalm. But David was not the first person to call God his shepherd. And it's a theme that goes throughout the Bible. Ezekiel refers to God as a shepherd. You see it in the New Testament as well. You see God referred to as the shepherd repeatedly. But the very first person who ever associated God with a shepherd was Jacob, of all people. Now, what's so interesting about that is because Jacob understood that God was his shepherd because he understood that he had lived his life like a sheep. And he understood that he needed a shepherd. Sheep need shepherds. He wasn't just calling God his shepherd. He understood something about his life, and he understood something about our lives too. Because we are all sheep. And I want to just remind you, if you're not familiar with sheep, of a couple characteristics of sheep. First of all, sheep are completely helpless. They have no natural defense mechanism whatsoever. A sheep can be overwhelmed and overcome by almost any creature, any predator at all. Sheep are stupid. They are among the dumbest of all livestock and probably all animals together. They're not very smart. They're just not very smart. Sheep are vulnerable. And sometimes sheep can be bad. All right, but they're also incredibly valuable. Sheep are so valuable. And so what does a farmer, what does a rancher do? They put a shepherd with the sheep to protect the sheep, to provide for the sheep, to make up for what they lack. And Jacob realized he needed a shepherd. He needed grace. And so do you. And so do I. Sheep need constant care, and so do we. You have experienced the need for grace in your life. As you look back over your life, maybe some of you are in a situation right now where you don't understand how the situation is going to be resolved. The only way that it can be resolved is if grace is applied. That's the only thing. The only thing that's going to save your marriage is if grace is applied. The only thing that's going to fix your relationship with your parents or your kids is if grace is applied. The only thing that's going to make it work out at work is if somebody brings a little grace into the conversation. Because grace is the missing ingredient. We all stand in need of grace, but we also see in this the experience of grace. Look what he said in verse 16. He said, God who has been my shepherd all my days, the angel who has delivered me from all harm. He's talking in present tense that God not only was God with him, but God provided him with the grace that he needed when he needed it. See, a lot of people will admit their need for grace, but fewer people will recognize when they've experienced grace. Now, some of you have. Like, your marriage is only together today because somebody extended grace. Your relationship with your family or a loved one or a relative is only restored because somebody extended grace in that situation. We can all look at situations where grace was needed, and then some of us can look at situations where we've actually experienced grace. Verse 16, Jacob had experienced God's grace throughout his life. He experienced it the night he wrestled with God, and God gave him his blessing. He experienced it even while he was being taken advantage of by his father-in-law, but he left there a wealthy man. He has experienced grace all along. He's experienced grace in two important aspects. First of all, Jacob saw his own foolishness, and he saw his own lostness. He recognized his need for it, but then he also began to see how God had become something more than just an idea, but God had become personal and intimate to him. And through that personal, intimate relationship, he saw evidence of God's grace all along. So the need for grace and the experience of grace. Now, nobody here is surprised by that. Right? We all recognize that. We can all say, yes, we've all needed grace. And some of us can say, yes, I've even experienced grace. It doesn't change anything about our world. It doesn't change anything about our relationships if you need grace and experience grace. But this third part, this is the part that is so incredibly absent from our world today. Because it's not just about the need and the experience, it's also about the filter of grace. It's about the filter of grace. How can grace change the way we view the world? How does it affect the way you think about other people, about the way you talk to other people? This is why the writer of Hebrews points to this story as being the crowning achievement of Jacob's life. Not because he needed grace and not because he'd experienced grace. A lot of people needed grace. A lot of people experienced grace, but grace actually changed the way Jacob viewed the world. How do we know this? Because look at how he blesses Joseph's sons. Look at verse 10. Now Israel's eyes were failing because of old age, and he could hardly see. One generation before, Jacob's dad, Isaac, had the same problem. He couldn't see. He didn't have the eyes to be able to see. And what did Jacob do in response? He used his dad's poor eyesight to trick his dad into giving him his brother Esau's blessing. Remember that story? He dressed up like his brother and he went in and he stole the blessing. He took advantage of his dad's poor eyesight. Now, fast forward a whole generation. Now Jacob is the one with poor eyesight. He can hardly see. And so what does Joseph do? Joseph comes to him and he brings his two boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he strategically places the older son so that when Jacob extends his hands, his right hand will be on the older son's head and he will get the blessing. Verse 14, but Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and crossed his arms, and he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. And so what does Joseph do? Joseph tries to correct his dad. He's like, no, Dad, you can't see. Clearly, your eyes aren't that good. Let me help you out here. And so he tries to move his arms. But Jacob says, I know exactly what I'm doing. I mean to bless the younger son. And for the first time in his life, for the very first time in his life, Jacob is finally seeing clearly because he's seeing through the lens of grace. Not just that he needed it and not just that he experienced it, but it is actually changing the way he is interacting with the world around him. And he sees the world differently in two aspects. First of all, he sees it differently on a social aspect, on a social reality of grace, but he also sees it differently in his own personal agenda, on a personal reality. And I want to look at both of these. So first, let's look at the social reality of what it means when we look through the world through the lens of grace. Why does Joseph get so mad at his dad, Jacob, when he crosses his arms? Because Joseph was a man of his time. Joseph was the prime minister of the world superpower. He understood how the world worked. He understood that things get done through certain people. And so you have to work in the system the way the world has it. Boys, not girls. The oldest, not the younger. The wealthy, not the poor. And we think of that today, and we look back on that with our modern view, and we say, man, the world has changed, right? We think to ourselves, that's such an antiquated way to view the world. Boys, not girls, the older, not the younger. But isn't it true that we still have a hierarchy today? It might be a different economy. It might be a different thing that we're looking at, but we still look at the world and we still view people and we rate them based on things we see. It could be the color of their skin. It could be how much money they have. It could be their level of education. There are lots of things that we look at and you go about in the world today and you see different people and you have an automatic in your mind, and I know you do because I do. We all do because we've been raised in a society where we're taught to do this, where we're constantly evaluating people and we're stacking people up against each other. And our criteria today may be different from the criteria that they had then, but there is still a criteria. There is still a social order. There is still a way in which we view the world. Joseph was a man of his time, and he was doing what everybody else did. But Jacob refused to go along with that. He refused to operate according to the world's plan. And instead, he chooses to follow God's upside-down ways, the reverse ways of God's kingdom. And what's so interesting about this is when you begin to see it, you see it everywhere in the Bible. From the very beginning, all the way through. This idea of God's reversed, inverted, upside-down economy. Let me just cover a few of these with you just so that we can really get a sense of what God is doing in the big picture of the Bible. First of all, you go back to the very beginning and you had two brothers, Cain and Abel. And whose offering did God choose? The younger brother, Abel's offering. You had Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham. God chose to work through Isaac. You had Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, the strong, the hunter, the man's man. God chose to work through Jacob. He didn't choose the younger, fertile Hagar to bear Isaac. the child of promise. Instead, he chose the old, barren Sarah. He didn't choose the beautiful Rachel. He chose the plain, homely Leah. You go further into the New Testament and you see stories like the man named Gideon, who was the smallest, most insignificant person in his family, and the smallest, most insignificant family in the tribe, and the smallest tribe in the nation. And God chose him and said, "You're who I'm going to use to deliver my people out of bondage." And then he goes off with an army, and God says, "The army's too big. I want a smaller, weaker army. And so I'm going to choose you, Gideon, to overthrow the enemy." He chose a shepherd boy to bring down a giant. And it's not just in the Old Testament. You follow this idea right into the New Testament as well. Because you get into the New Testament and you realize that Jesus often chose prostitutes over priests, tax collectors over Pharisees. There was always a socially, racially, more morally outside person that God was choosing over the insider. It is a pattern and a theme throughout the entire Scripture that God's economy opposes the economy of the world. God works through people that the world would otherwise overlook and neglect and leave out. God works through people that others might think are failures. This is the hope and the message of the gospel, that God's grace flows through the least likely. Why is that? Because maybe it's only the underdog and the neglected and the forgotten who understand their need for grace to begin with. Maybe it's the prostitute who understands the need for grace. It's the tax collector who understood his need for grace. It's the morally bankrupt person who understood the need and experienced grace, and through that experience of grace began to view the world differently. Jacob was that person. He had stood in the need of grace, he had experienced grace, and now that grace was beginning to change the way he viewed the world. And why is this a pattern that God repeats throughout the Scriptures? Because it's all pointing to the way that God is going to bring about salvation to the world. It's all pointing us to a Savior who would come into the world not in power but in weakness, not in wealth but in poverty. It is a Savior who would win not through military conquest or political achievement. He would win through losing. That Jesus himself would become the ultimate example of the outsider who would win the victory of our salvation through his death on the cross. See, every other religion, every other faith says that it is all about the effort that you will put in that will determine whether or not you're saved. It is about what you do. Do you do enough? Are you good enough? Are you smart enough? Have you given enough? Do you show up to church or worship enough? Are you giving the right kind of offering and sacrifice? Every other religion talks about the need for your effort in order to achieve salvation, but the gospel calls us all to admit that we are weak, we have failed, we are powerless, and there is no way we can be saved unless a good shepherd comes and rescues us. See, grace is the unique ingredient that is only found in the message of the gospel. It's only found in the good shepherd who laid down his life to save us. See, Joseph was just operating out of the world's economy, just like so often I operate out of the world's economy, and my guess is you do too. But grace invites us to view the world differently. Jacob understood that, and he began to change the way he viewed the world as he viewed the world through the filter of grace. And my question for you is, has grace changed the way you view the world? Does it change the way you interact with people around you? People who don't agree with you? People whose politics are different than yours? People who you may find morally offensive? People who are on the down and out? Does it change the way you see the poor? Does it change the way you see the elderly or the very young, the immigrants and the refugees? Is grace changing your filter? And if it's not, my question is, have you ever experienced it? But for far too many Christians, we experience the need and we experience grace itself, but we never allow that grace to change the way we actually see the world around us. Jacob did that. But it was just more than a social reality. It was also a personal reality. Joseph had a plan for his boys, just like every dad has a plan for their sons. He had something he wanted to see them do, but Jacob messed up the plans by blessing the wrong son. And Jacob was ultimately saying to Joseph, God has other plans, and you should trust that God's plans are better than yours. God's plans for your children are better than your plans. God's plans for your life are better than your plans for your life. Look what he said in Genesis 48:15. The God who has been my shepherd all my life. The God who has been my shepherd all my life. That's a remarkable statement when you've followed along Jacob's journey throughout his entire life. What he is saying here is he is recognizing that God wasn't just my shepherd when I finally found my son who was still alive. No. He is saying, God was my shepherd when I was being raised by a father who didn't love me. All my life, he's been my shepherd. God was my shepherd when I was manipulated for over 20 years by a boss and father-in-law. God was my shepherd even then. God was my shepherd when I was forced to marry a woman that I didn't love. God was my shepherd when I did marry the woman I loved and she died a couple years later. God was my shepherd when my favorite son was taken away from me and I thought he was dead. God was my shepherd for all those years that I lived in grief and total despair and depression. God was my shepherd, not just when things went right. God was my shepherd when things went wrong. God was with me in the valley when I couldn't see. That's grace. See, it's not just a filter that changes the way you view other people. It's a filter that changes the way you view your experience in life. Have you allowed the filter of grace to cause you to look back at some of the darkest moments of your life and say, he was my shepherd then too? He was my shepherd through bankruptcy and through divorce. He was my shepherd through cancer. He was my shepherd through the loss of a loved one. He was my shepherd in the darkest times. It's easy to recognize him when we're on the mountaintop. It's a lot harder to see him in the valley. The Lord is my shepherd. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Do you see him with you in the valley? Because he is. He's with you in the valley. And the filter of grace allows you to see that. It changes the way you view the world, and it changes the way you view your story, and it changes the way you understand God in the difficult times as well. Jacob recognized that he had always been a sheep in need of a shepherd, and that God had always been his good shepherd. And so by grace, Jacob can finally say, at the end of his life, thy will be done, whatever it is. Because grace allows me to see that you are a good shepherd, and while it may not feel good in real time, I trust you, God. That's what Jacob sees at the end of his life, that God is a good shepherd. Look what he said in verse 16. The angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the name of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth. He talks about this angel who delivered him. The Hebrew term there is actually the word goel, and it's a term for redeemer. And this was actually a role that somebody played in a family. You probably have a family member like this too. You know, the family member that everybody calls when things go wrong. Some of you may be that person. Others of you know immediately. Like if the wheels come off the bus in the family, this is who we're calling. Because they will come and put the wheels back on the bus. They're the person, you know, if you're arrested, they're going to bring the bail money. That's who this person is. All right. That's the goel. This was the person in Israel. If somebody had a debt they couldn't pay and they'd been sold into slavery to pay off the debt, this is the person who would come and pay the debt so the person could be redeemed from slavery. So when Jacob says and calls this angel his redeemer, his goel, he is saying, I realize that I was in debt and it was a debt I could not pay, and that God has ransomed me and delivered me from it. It's a radical thing for Jacob to believe. I mean, I understand why we believe it. We believe it because we see the way the story goes. We see the way God fulfills his promise through Jesus. Jacob didn't see that. But we have this verse in John chapter 10 where Jesus talks about this. John chapter 10 verse 11, he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He's the goel. He's the redeemer. He's the good shepherd who rescues his sheep. Let me ask you, do you right now in your life need grace? I mean, right now, the situation that you're in, the only resolution to it will come if somebody has grace. Do you recognize the grace that you've already experienced in your life? For many of us here, we do. The greatest example of that is God's redemption of us through his son, Jesus Christ, that we've experienced his grace. That's not going to change the world. It might change your life, it might change your family, it might change your eternity. But the only way the world gets changed is when people who have needed grace and experienced grace allow that grace to change the way then they view the world. When grace becomes the filter by which we see the world around us. When we stop looking at our life and our history, when we stop looking at other people through the economy of the world, and instead we see them through the lens of the cross. See, grace is not just something we need or receive. It is God's power to reshape how we see ourselves, others, in the world. And that's what we need today. That's what our politics needs. That's what relationships need. In Jesus, grace reorders our lives and it reframes our future. The cross becomes the lens through which we see and judge everything. So my invitation for you today is to view the world through the lens of grace. That's easier said than done. In fact, I've got a question for you this week when you hit a difficult situation, and my guess is you will. Here's the question. What would grace require of me? What would grace look like in this situation? What would grace be like in this conversation? Just ask yourself that question. It's a simple question, but it's not easy. And here's the thing. If you actually begin to view the world that way, and you actually decide you're going to take action based on the answer to that question, let me give you a warning. It will cost you more than you want to pay. It will cost you more than you want to pay. And the reason I know that is because it cost Jesus everything. It cost him everything to view you that way and for him to extend the grace to you. So my challenge for all of us today is to be people who bring the missing ingredient of grace into a world that so desperately lacks it. As a commissioning for us to do that, we're going to take communion. The greatest tangible example of God's grace as the Good Shepherd literally laid down his life for us. So as you're invited forward, you're going to come and you're going to get a piece of bread, and the bread has been broken. And you're going to hear the words, the body of Christ broken for you, and you're going to take it and you're going to dip it in the cup, and you're going to hear the words, the blood of Christ poured out for you. And then, if you dare, you eat it. And why do I say if you dare? Because here's the thing. What you've received should change the way you live. What you receive should change the way you think. It should change the way you view the world. It should change the way you speak. And so I'm going to invite our deacons and those serving communion to take their places. There's going to be an usher who's going to come up to your right and release you from the row. And then if you'll come around, take communion and go back to your left, that'll keep folks moving. If you are here today and you don't want to come forward, or you maybe have a physical limitation, you want to stay where you are, the ushers will have the elements in their basket they can share with you. There'll be folks in the balcony as well. And the invitation is for you to come, not just to receive this as a religious ritual, but to receive this as a commitment on your part and our part to be people who acknowledge our need for grace, who celebrate our experience of grace, and who are committed to living life through the filter of grace.